The night settles over Queens like a slow exhale. Streetlights cast long golden halos over cracked sidewalks, and the hum of passing cars fades into the rhythm of the city that never really sleeps. Somewhere in South Jamaica, 1980s New York breathes a different kind of air, thicker, heavier, laced with tension and money. This is where the story begins, in a world where the law's shadow is long, but one man's reach is longer. People called him Fat Cat. But behind that nickname was Lorenzo Nichols, the man who would one day rule Queens like a quiet, dangerous king. You can almost see him standing by the window of a modest apartment, the glow of the street reflecting off his gold watch. Outside, the neighborhood moves with unspoken order, corner dealers, lookouts, drivers waiting in idling cars. They all work like parts of a machine, and the man behind it all runs it with calm precision. There's something disarming about his demeanor. He doesn't yell, doesn't rush. He carries himself like someone who already knows he's won. But power, especially in Queens during the height of the crack era, was never a gift. It was something carved from the chaos, one street at a time. The air hums with contradiction. Children play outside under the dim light, their laughter mixing with the distant wail of sirens. In the corner store, an old man counts small bills, grateful for the protection that keeps the block safe. Because when Fat Cat ruled, crime wasn't random, it was business. He was feared, yes, but also respected. For every act of violence whispered about him, there was another story, of him paying rent for struggling families, of handing out turkeys during Thanksgiving. In a strange way, his presence gave order to a world that was otherwise falling apart. The 1980s in Queens were painted in neon and danger. Drugs had flooded the city, and the economy of the streets rivaled that of Wall Street itself. Police patrols were constant, but the real power moved in silence. The neighborhoods were divided, territories drawn like invisible maps that everyone seemed to know by heart. And at the center of it all was Nichols, calm, strategic, a man who understood that control wasn't about muscle alone. It was about respect, timing, and trust. His empire wasn't just about drugs, it was about influence. A nod from him could mean a payday. A glare could mean the end of everything. At night, when the noise softened and the city seemed to whisper, people would talk about him in low tones. Fat Cat runs this side, they'd say, as if repeating an unspoken rule. His name carried both fear and safety, an odd mixture that made him almost mythical. Some claimed he was ruthless, that he'd order punishment without hesitation. Others said he was a man of honor, someone who followed a street code that valued loyalty above all. The truth, like the city itself, was layered. In Queens, morality was relative, and for many, Fat Cat was the closest thing to justice they knew. But every king lives under a countdown he cannot see. Beneath the luxury cars and the piles of cash, cracks were already forming. Friends were turning into enemies, and the same loyalty that once built his empire would one day destroy it. The calm before the storm always feels like peace, but it's only silence waiting to be broken. And for Lorenzo Nichols, the silence of Queens was about to grow louder than ever before. In the quiet of his reign, he probably didn't think about the end. Few kings do. There were no mirrors big enough to reflect the cost of power, the betrayals, the constant fear of a knock at the door, the cold eyes of the law watching from the distance. Yet for now, in this opening scene of his life's empire, he stands untouchable. The city bends around him, both afraid and loyal, both hating and needing the man they call Fat Cat. Queens was his kingdom. The streets were his throne. But as history would show, even the strongest rulers are prisoners of their own making. And when the time came, Fat Cat Nichols would learn that the higher the climb, the harder the fall. Tonight, though, under the soft hum of the city, he remains the king of Queens, powerful, respected, and unaware that the empire he built was already starting to whisper its goodbye. The 1950s in Jamaica, Queens, were a world away from the glittering image of New York seen in films and postcards. Here, the streets told stories of struggle, families trying to stretch every dollar, children learning early that survival was a skill, not a privilege. Among those children was a boy named Lorenzo Nichols. No one knew then that he would one day become Fat Cat, the man whose name would echo across Queens like a legend. Back then, he was just a quiet kid with sharp eyes, a kid who noticed everything, who was watching, who had power, and who didn't. He grew up surrounded by hard lessons. The sound of the city was never still, trains clattering overhead, street vendors calling out, sirens wailing in the distance. Life was fast, unforgiving. His mother worked tirelessly, doing what she could to keep food on the table. His father's presence was often a memory more than a reality, and young Lorenzo learned early that if he wanted something, he'd have to find a way to get it himself. The streets became his school, and the people on them, his teachers. They taught him about money, loyalty, deception, and respect. And unlike most boys his age, Lorenzo was listening closely. He wasn't the loudest or the toughest, but he was observant. He saw how men with confidence and cash could command a room without raising their voices. He noticed how the smallest gestures, a nod, a handshake, a favor, carried invisible power. In his neighborhood, the line between survival and success was paper-thin, and Lorenzo understood that better than most. He wanted more than just to survive, he wanted control. That quiet hunger for control, for independence, would shape every choice he made in the years to come. By the late 1960s, Queens was changing. The economy was slipping, jobs were disappearing, and young men were turning to the streets for opportunity. Drugs, numbers running, stolen goods, these weren't just crimes, they were the currency of the neighborhood. Lorenzo started small, hustling where he could, but even then, he stood apart. He didn't waste time on chaos. Every move he made was measured, thought out. He wasn't chasing thrills, he was building something, even if he didn't yet know what. Friends remember him as disciplined, always dressed clean, even when broke. He had an aura that made people listen. In a world where tempers flared and violence came easy, he carried a calm that unnerved people. That calm wasn't peace, it was calculation. He was already learning the first rule of street power: control your emotions, and you control the room. Anger could be used, but never wasted. Fear could be felt, but never shown. These weren't things he read in a book, they were instincts sharpened by a world that punished weakness. There were nights when he'd walk the block alone, looking at the lights in apartment windows, thinking about the kind of life he wanted. He didn't want to be another name lost to poverty or prison. He wanted to be remembered, to be respected, to be untouchable. The world around him was filled with examples, men who had taken nothing and built small kingdoms out of grit and violence. Some would call them criminals, but to kids like Lorenzo, they were proof that power was possible. They didn't follow the system, they built their own. As he entered his late teens, the seeds of ambition had already taken root. Lorenzo wasn't interested in petty crime for its own sake. He had a talent for organization, for bringing people together and making them work like parts of a machine. He had charisma, the kind that made people want to follow him. Even older men started to notice the young Nichols boy who carried himself like someone far beyond his years. In a neighborhood full of noise, he was quiet, and that made him dangerous. There were moments of softness, too. He cared for his family, especially his mother, who saw more good in him than the streets ever would. He'd help neighbors when he could, sometimes slipping money to a struggling mother or helping an old man fix his car. But those gestures came from a sense of code, not sentimentality. He believed in respect, and in the unwritten laws of the community. That moral code, loyalty, protection, and repayment, would later define how he ran his empire. He didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a man balancing the scales in a world that was never fair to begin with. By the end of the 1970s, the boy from South Jamaica was no longer just another face in the crowd. He had built a reputation, smart, level-headed, and reliable. People started calling him by a nickname, Fat Cat, not as an insult, but as a mark of status. He wore it like armor. Every street legend starts with a name, and his had just begun to carry weight. The world that once seemed to crush him now began to bend slightly in his direction. He was no longer watching from the sidelines. The lessons of survival had turned into the language of strategy. Lorenzo Nichols had learned how the game worked, and soon, he'd start rewriting the rules. The young man who once walked these streets with empty pockets now had a plan, and Queens was about to feel the weight of it. The king was still years from his throne, but his crown was already forming, one quiet decision at a time. The 1970s brought with them a new rhythm, the pulse of a city teetering between chaos and opportunity. In Queens, the rules of survival had changed, and for a young Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols, this was the moment when his quiet ambition began to harden into something sharper, something deliberate. He was no longer the boy who simply observed. He was now the man testing the boundaries of power, learning that success on the streets wasn't about who was loudest, but who was smartest, who could see 10 steps ahead when everyone else was focused on the next dollar. It started with small hustles, but even small things in Lorenzo's hands became organized. He had a knack for seeing patterns, how money moved, how people operated, how systems failed. He began coordinating small thefts, fencing stolen goods, and managing low-level dealers. Nothing flashy, nothing reckless. He didn't want the kind of attention that got people locked up or buried. He wanted to build quietly, methodically. His moves were like chess, every piece had purpose, every sacrifice calculated. The streets were the board, and he was beginning to see how to control it. By his early 20s, Nichols had gathered a small circle of trusted men around him. They weren't the biggest or the baddest, but they were loyal, and loyalty, he believed, was worth more than muscle. These were the men who'd go on to become the roots of his empire, though at the time, they were just hustlers trying to survive. Lorenzo guided them with a kind of street wisdom that made sense: don't attract attention, don't talk too much, keep your word. It was an unspoken code, and it built something that money alone couldn't buy: trust. Queens in those years was a raw, electric place. The sounds of funk and early hip-hop spilled out from cars, kids in tracksuits hung around corners, and the economy of the street was thriving beneath the city's nose. Drugs were beginning to shape the underworld, but Lorenzo didn't rush into that world headfirst. He watched, he learned. He saw who was making money and who was losing their lives. He studied the mistakes of others like a student of human nature. Where others saw quick profit, he saw structure. He realized the power of systems, how control over supply, distribution, and loyalty could build something far larger than any single deal. His charisma began to show. He wasn't a man who demanded respect with threats, he earned it through calm control. When disputes arose, Lorenzo mediated. When deals needed coordination, he handled the math himself. He carried himself differently, never desperate, never frantic. Even in moments of tension, his voice remained even, his eyes steady. To his crew, this composure was both reassuring and intimidating. It made him seem untouchable, like nothing could shake him. And in the world of street business, that illusion of invincibility was often as powerful as the real thing. But power, even in its early form, comes with a cost. Nichols began attracting attention, from competitors, from law enforcement, and from men who wanted what he was building. Rumors spread of his growing influence. Some said he was lucky, others whispered that he was connected to bigger players, maybe even the mafia. The truth was simpler: he was organized in a world that thrived on disorder. He didn't just survive the streets, he systematized them. His first real run-ins with the law came around this time. A few arrests, minor charges, brief stays behind bars. But even these moments became lessons. He learned how police operated, how investigations unfolded, and how to stay one step ahead. Jail wasn't a setback, it was research. He used the time to think, to plan. Each mistake became a data point, each betrayal a note in his mental ledger. By the time he walked out, he wasn't angry. He was sharper. He had learned that fear could motivate, but consistency could rule. What set Nichols apart was his ability to combine logic and loyalty. He didn't chase chaos, he organized it. When he began dipping into the more serious trades, the kind that brought in real money and real risk, he did it quietly. His operation grew like a shadow, expanding, moving, adapting. To outsiders, it seemed like luck. To those inside, it felt like following a map drawn by a man who could see the future. And while others were celebrating small victories, Nichols was already thinking about scale, how to control not just a corner, but an entire network. The city around him was boiling. Corruption, addiction, and violence were tightening their grip on New York. But Lorenzo had learned to move like water, to flow where resistance was weakest, to adapt, to survive. He wasn't chasing the crown yet, but the path toward it was clearing with every calculated move he made. The boy who once watched from the sidelines was now setting the pace for everyone else. By the late 1970s, people in Queens had started talking about him differently. He was no longer just another street hustler, he was a strategist, a man whose reach extended further than anyone realized. He had a presence, not just physical, but psychological. Men wanted to work with him, women admired him, and rivals quietly feared him. He had become the invisible hand shaping the flow of the streets. Still, Lorenzo Nichols knew this was only the beginning. Power, real power, wasn't built on quick hustles or small profits, it was built on loyalty, structure, and patience. He could feel the city shifting beneath his feet, preparing him for something greater. The nights in Queens grew louder, faster, more dangerous. But in the center of that storm, Nichols remained calm, a man waiting for his empire to take shape, one move at a time. The streets of Queens in the late 1970s were like a living organism, pulsing, unpredictable, alive with both danger and opportunity. From the cracked sidewalks to the flickering streetlights, every block had its own rhythm, and every player knew their place in the unspoken hierarchy of hustlers, dealers, and dreamers. Amid this chaos, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols began shaping something new, something that would soon become one of the most feared and respected organizations in New York's underworld. He wasn't looking to be another street name. He was building a syndicate, structured, disciplined, and profitable. It started with trust. Lorenzo knew that power came not from the number of men you had, but from the quality of their loyalty. He began hand-picking his people, men who weren't just fearless, but who could follow orders, who understood discretion. Howard "Pappy" Mason was among the first. Pappy was explosive, unpredictable, but when guided, he was a force of nature. Then came Thomas "Tony" Mickens, Gerald "Prince" Miller, and others who each brought their own skills to the table. Together, they would form what came to be known as the South Side Crew, a street family built not just on money, but on structure and respect. Nichols didn't run his crew like the wild gangs tearing through other parts of the city. He thought like a businessman. Everyone had a role, every corner had a system, and every move was calculated. They controlled their product, their distribution, and even their reputation. Violence was used sparingly, not as chaos, but as punctuation. When Fat Cat's name was mentioned, people didn't laugh or shout. They lowered their voices. He didn't need to raise his tone to be heard. His authority was quiet, absolute, and that made him more powerful than anyone realized. The South Side Syndicate operated with precision. Runners moved drugs through carefully chosen channels, middlemen handled money collection, and lieutenants enforced discipline. Nichols sat at the top, orchestrating it all. From a distance, his operation looked almost corporate, clean, efficient, and effective. He paid his people well, demanded respect, and punished betrayal swiftly but silently. He was both a father figure and a CEO, commanding fear and admiration in equal measure. The streets called him a boss, those close to him called him the Cat, because, like his namesake, he always landed on his feet. Queens, at the time, was boiling under the surface. Rival crews fought for territory, police corruption was rampant, and the crack epidemic was just beginning to explode. Nichols saw the storm coming long before most. He understood that chaos was bad for business. Where others chased quick money, he built infrastructure, safe houses, stash spots, transport routes. He turned street corners into efficient nodes of commerce. His foresight was what set him apart. To the untrained eye, he looked like another neighborhood figure. To those in the know, he was already running one of the most organized street networks in New York. His leadership style was deliberate and calm, but his eyes missed nothing. He demanded punctuality, cleanliness, and discipline. His lieutenants would later say that Fat Cat ran the streets like a corporation: meetings, reports, structure, and accountability. If you worked for him, you knew your place, your duties, and your limits. It wasn't about fear alone, it was about belonging to something that worked. He made his men feel like soldiers in a cause larger than themselves. And that, more than anything, created loyalty that money alone could never buy. Every king builds his kingdom differently. Some rule with fire, others with words. Nichols ruled with order. He introduced systems that mimicked legitimate business, investment, reinvestment, and profit sharing. He took lessons from the mafia, from Wall Street, from anyone who knew how to control large flows of money without drawing attention. When police looked at his operation, they couldn't find the usual chaos. There were no flashy displays of violence, no sloppy traces. His empire operated in whispers and quiet exchanges. And in those whispers, his legend grew. The South Side Syndicate wasn't just a gang, it was a reflection of its creator: intelligent, patient, and strategic. Nichols encouraged his crew to dress well, stay sharp, and never appear desperate. "You can't lead looking like you're surviving," he once told one of his men. "You lead by showing them you're already where they want to be." That mentality shaped everything about how his operation functioned. Money moved up the chain, respect moved down it, and loyalty was the bridge between both. But beneath all the structure and calm leadership, there was tension. Power attracts attention, and attention brings enemies. Rival crews began to take notice of the quiet empire rising in Queens. Law enforcement started hearing whispers about a man running things differently, smarter, cleaner, more efficiently. And while Fat Cat was still below the radar of the federal government, local detectives were starting to circle. They couldn't yet touch him, but they could feel his influence spreading. Like a shadow growing longer each night. Even as pressure built, Nichols remained composed. He understood that the most dangerous move was to look afraid. He doubled down on his discipline, teaching his men that panic was poison. He believed that an empire could only fall from within, through betrayal or carelessness, never from the outside. So he tightened his circle, cut off weak links, and reinforced the bonds that held his crew together. Those who stayed loyal prospered. Those who didn't were quietly erased from the equation. By the early 1980s, the South Side Syndicate had become a silent empire. Money flowed through its veins like lifeblood. Every block under their control ran smooth. And at the heart of it all stood Fat Cat Nichols, a man who had taken the raw chaos of the streets and turned it into an organized machine. His dream was no longer survival. It was legacy. He wanted to be remembered not as a gangster, but as a man who took the game and mastered it. But as history would soon show, every empire carries the seeds of its own destruction. For now, though, in the glow of streetlights and the hum of the city, Fat Cat Nichols sat at the top of his new world, a quiet ruler in the shadows of Queens, unaware that the cracks beneath his kingdom were already beginning to form. The 1980s arrived like a fever dream for New York City: neon lights, fast cars, booming music, and a dangerous new economy pulsing through its veins. In Queens, that economy was the drug trade, and at its center stood Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols, now fully ascended to the role of a kingpin. His empire was vast, precise, and profitable beyond imagination. The South Side Syndicate had evolved into a machine that moved money and product through the borough with a smoothness that rivaled legitimate corporations. For Nichols, this was the golden age, the height of his reign. The streets whispered his name with both fear and admiration. Fat Cat runs Queens, people said, and they weren't wrong. His influence stretched from the housing projects of South Jamaica to high-end car dealerships and nightclubs in Manhattan. He was no longer a small-time hustler, he was a businessman who commanded respect across every layer of the underworld. He controlled not just the product, but the flow of cash, the loyalty of men, and the rhythm of the streets themselves. He didn't flaunt his wealth recklessly, instead, he let it speak for him. The glint of a gold chain, the shine of a new Cadillac, the quiet confidence in his step, these were the marks of a man who didn't need to prove anything. Money poured in faster than it could be counted. The crack cocaine explosion of the 1980s transformed the city, and Nichols was one of the few who knew how to manage its chaos. His network was disciplined. Couriers moved shipments with military precision, lieutenants handled collections, and distributors kept the product pure and the streets orderly. Where other dealers drowned in greed and recklessness, Nichols built structure. He had rules, no unnecessary violence, no sloppy behavior, and no crossing internal lines. To his crew, he was more than a boss, he was a model of how power could exist without noise. But the riches of the underworld came with their own kind of glow, one that drew eyes, both wanted and unwanted. The community knew his name, but not everyone hated it. For many, Fat Cat's rule brought stability. He gave back to the neighborhood in ways the government didn't. He handed out food on holidays, paid for funerals, helped single mothers with rent, and even sponsored local events. His generosity was both genuine and strategic. It bought him the loyalty of the streets and built an image of a benevolent king. To some, he was a savior, to others, a devil wearing gold-rimmed glasses. Inside his world, power was intoxicating but fragile. Nichols moved through his days like a man aware that he stood on a tightrope, one misstep away from collapse. Yet, for now, everything worked perfectly. He ran meetings like a corporate executive, calm and precise. He spoke softly, and his men listened closely. Even rival crews began to respect his method, his ability to turn a dangerous, bloody business into something that looked almost legitimate. He avoided the spotlight, understanding that fame was poison in the underworld. While others like Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas had fallen under the weight of their own notoriety, Fat Cat kept his head down, letting whispers build his legend for him. The imagery of his reign was cinematic. Streets lit by corner lamps where deals were struck in silence. Luxury cars lined up outside bars that doubled as meeting spots. The smell of cash and gasoline, the faint hum of music from passing radios, the laughter of men who believed they were untouchable. Queens was his canvas, and he painted it with precision and power. The police knew who he was, but they couldn't touch him. He operated behind layers of protection, each level insulated from the next. His organization was airtight. Still, even at the height of his power, Nichols never let comfort dull his instincts. He knew that wealth invited envy, and envy led to betrayal. Every smile was measured, every conversation remembered. The line between friend and foe was thin. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man enjoying success. In truth, he was always calculating, always scanning the horizon for threats. It was this awareness, this constant readiness, that kept him on top longer than most. There were moments of luxury that reflected just how far he'd come. Nights in lavish hotels, private parties where laughter echoed over clinking glasses, and quiet drives through Queens in cars that gleamed under the city lights. But even then, his mind never rested. He wasn't chasing pleasure, he was maintaining control. Every move was a strategy, every dollar reinvested, every alliance tested for weakness. He was building an empire meant to last, one that could survive even if he couldn't. Yet beneath the gold and success, something darker stirred. The streets were changing. The drug wars were intensifying, and younger, reckless players were flooding the game. The same product that had made Nichols rich was now turning his kingdom volatile. Violence was becoming unavoidable, and greed was infecting even the most disciplined soldiers. Nichols could sense the shift, but for the moment, he chose stability. He tightened his circle, strengthened his leadership, and reminded his men that the true power of a king was not in how loud he roared, but how long he could stay standing when everyone else fell. By the mid-1980s, Fat Cat Nichols had achieved what few in his position ever could: total control. His organization was feared by rivals, respected by allies, and admired by the very people it operated among. The money was endless, the influence unmatched, and his legend was only growing. From the outside, he seemed invincible, the calm ruler of a city built on chaos. But power, no matter how quietly held, has a way of drawing its own downfall. The seeds of betrayal and obsession were already sprouting in the shadows. The same loyalty that had built his empire would one day test its limits. For now, though, under the hum of the streetlights and the heartbeat of Queens, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols sat atop his throne, a man who had turned concrete into gold, unaware that every empire, no matter how perfect, eventually begins to crack. The 1980s were roaring, and with them came a flood of wealth, chaos, and paranoia. Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols sat at the center of it all, a man who had turned street hustle into structured power. His operation now stretched far beyond street corners. It was a living system, sustained by money, loyalty, and silence. But what separated Fat Cat from most crime bosses wasn't just his control over the streets, it was his double life, the careful image of a legitimate businessman who could shake hands with politicians by day and rule the underworld by night. To outsiders, Nichols looked respectable. He wore tailored suits, drove clean cars, and maintained real businesses, car dealerships, auto body shops, laundromats, and even a few rental properties. These fronts were not only about laundering money, they were about identity. They made him appear grounded, professional, almost ordinary. His office had files, invoices, and phone lines that all seemed legitimate. Employees came and went, unaware that their boss was one of the most powerful figures in the Queen's drug trade. The facade was so convincing that even those close to him sometimes forgot where the real money came from. This duality fascinated people, the idea that a man could exist comfortably in two worlds at once. During the day, Nichols could sit in an office counting legitimate profits, answering calls about car repairs or property rentals. But as night fell, his world shifted. Quiet phone calls, coded messages, and brief meetings in the back of bars filled his evenings. Every deal, every dollar moved through a system designed to keep him insulated. He didn't handle drugs himself anymore, he handled people, logistics, and strategy. The real currency was trust, and Nichols controlled it masterfully. He understood optics better than most. Image was power, and maintaining it was survival. The legitimate businesses gave him something more than financial cover, they gave him psychological distance. It allowed him to justify what he was doing. To him, he wasn't a criminal. He was a man managing multiple enterprises, some legal, some not. It was business. The streets were his market, and his crew were employees. His world was organized, and order gave him peace. That calm, calculated demeanor became his signature, a man who could move millions and still sleep soundly at night. But beneath that calm exterior, the pressure was constant. The DEA and NYPD had started noticing patterns: money that didn't match income, phone records that connected unlikely businesses, names that appeared too often in investigations. Fat Cat's dual life required constant vigilance. He couldn't afford mistakes. Every handshake, every deal, every phone call had to fit the mask he'd created. To live as both a businessman and a criminal required precision. One slip, one moment of carelessness, and the illusion would crumble. Inside his circle, only a few men knew how deep the operation went. Happy Mason remained his fiery enforcer, a man of action who thrived on fear. Nichols needed him, but he also feared the instability that came with him. While Fat Cat valued structure, Mason lived for chaos. Together, they balanced each other, one brain, one muscle, but that balance was fragile. The more their empire grew, the harder it became to control every moving part. The money brought comfort, but it also brought paranoia. Nichols began watching his own men more closely, studying who spoke too freely, who spent too much, who started acting different. In his world, small signs often meant big problems. There were moments when he'd sit alone in his car outside one of his businesses, engine idling, cigarette burning slowly in his hand. The neon lights would reflect off the windshield, casting red and blue across his face. He'd think about what it all meant, the rise, the money, the fear. Power had a way of isolating him. The same people who once saw him as a savior now looked at him with awe or quiet resentment. He had built everything he ever wanted, yet trust had become a rare luxury. Every day, he had to act. The businessman. The boss. The king. The man who never blinked. His control extended even to the smallest details. He managed his image so carefully that few people outside his circle ever saw. His temper. In public, he was composed, articulate, even polite. But in private, when someone disrespected the order he'd built, his anger came out like a quiet storm, no shouting, no wild threats, just a cold look and a decision that someone would disappear. Discipline was the heart of his empire. Emotion was weakness. By the mid-1980s, Nichols' life had become a delicate performance, the businessman who smiled for photos and the street general who ruled the night. He moved through the world like a man walking a tightrope, balancing reputation on one side and survival on the other. Each day demanded composure, each night demanded control. The irony was not lost on him, the more he tried to live a normal life, the more unnatural it became. Behind the glass doors of his car dealership, the sound of engines filled the air, clean, legal commerce at its finest. But in the shadows of the same building, deals were being planned, debts were being collected, and the underworld thrived. 2 lives, 1 man, and a city that couldn't decide whether to fear him or admire him. To many in Queens, Fat Cat Nichols was the embodiment of success, the man who rose from nothing and made the system work for him. But to those who looked closer, they could see something else, the quiet weight in his eyes, the knowledge that everything he built rested on lies and loyalty that could vanish overnight. And though he didn't know it yet, the mask of the businessman would one day become the very thing that doomed him. For every empire that hides behind legitimacy, there comes a moment when the facade cracks, when the world sees both faces of the king. But for now, under the glow of office lights and the hum of the streets below, Fat Cat Nichols was living his masterpiece, a life split perfectly between the comfort of success and the cold edge of survival. Power attracts loyalty, but it also breeds danger. By the mid-1980s, Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols was not just a name whispered in Queens, he was a force. His empire was well-oiled, precise, and growing faster than anyone could have imagined. Yet, no empire stands alone. Every king has his generals, and Fat Cat's most trusted, and most volatile, was Howard "Pappy" Mason. Their partnership would define the peak of Fat Cat's power, and plant the seeds of his downfall. Pappy Mason was the opposite of Nichols in every way imaginable. Where Fat Cat was calm and methodical, Pappy was raw energy, loud, intimidating, and unpredictable. He had a presence that filled rooms and emptied them just as quickly. He was the kind of man whose reputation preceded him, a soldier forged in the violence of the streets. Mason was fearless, almost to a fault, and Fat Cat saw in him something both powerful and dangerous, the kind of loyalty that could conquer the city, and the kind of rage that could burn it down. Their bond began in trust. Mason respected Nichols' intelligence, his composure, his ability to make sense of chaos. Nichols, in turn, valued Mason's loyalty and his willingness to handle the kind of problems that required brute force. Together, they became a perfect balance, brain and brawn, strategy and execution. Pappy was the enforcer, the hammer that ensured Fat Cat's rules were never broken. If Nichols was the king, Mason was his sword. The streets quickly learned that disrespecting one meant dealing with the wrath of both. In the early days of their partnership, everything ran smoothly. Mason's reputation kept people in line, and Nichols' leadership kept the operation running efficiently. The two men shared mutual respect, even friendship. They'd sit in Fat Cat's office after hours, smoke curling in the air, money counted neatly on the desk between them. They spoke of expansion, of tightening control, of pushing further without making the same mistakes other bosses had. There was ambition in both of them, but for Nichols, it was controlled ambition, for Mason, it was hunger. Pappy Mason was a man of extremes. He believed fear was the purest form of respect, and he enforced Nichols' rules with terrifying precision. If a man stole, he disappeared. If someone talked, their silence was bought, permanently. Mason's violence became legend in Queens. To some, it was protection, to others, it was terror. And while Nichols preferred diplomacy, he never stopped Mason. He understood that fear kept his empire intact. In Mason's rage, he found order, a grim necessity for maintaining control in a city on the brink. But over time, cracks began to show. Mason's power grew with every act of enforcement. His name began to echo almost as loudly as Fat Cat's. The media started mentioning both men in the same breath. To outsiders, they were equals. To Nichols, that was a dangerous illusion. Fat Cat believed in hierarchy, a structured chain of command where everyone knew their place. Mason's rising reputation, his growing independence, began to disrupt that balance. Fat Cat didn't need competition inside his own house, least of all from a man whose temper could ignite like gasoline. Their differences weren't just in personality, they were philosophical. Nichols valued control. He saw violence as a tool, not a lifestyle. To him, every move had to make sense, every punishment had to serve a purpose. Mason, on the other hand, believed fear itself was the message. If they're scared to breathe wrong, they'll never cross us, he'd say. Nichols didn't argue out loud, but inside, he knew fear had limits. It bought silence, not loyalty. And loyalty was the foundation of everything he'd built. The tension grew quietly at first. Small disagreements. Decisions questioned. Mason began operating more independently, taking actions without Nichols' approval. Some of these acts brought results, others brought chaos. Nichols tried to rein him in gently, but Mason wasn't a man who took well to restraint. To Pappy, control was something you seized, not something you waited for. Their partnership began to shift from unity to friction, from mutual reliance to quiet suspicion. Yet despite the tension, the two remained inseparable in the public eye. When they appeared together, they looked unstoppable, the strategist and the soldier, two sides of the same coin. Their chemistry made the empire stronger, but behind closed doors, that chemistry was becoming volatile. Nichols began to sense that Mason's impulsiveness could draw the kind of heat they couldn't afford. The DEA and NYPD were already paying attention, one reckless act could bring the entire structure crashing down. And Mason was becoming restless. The more powerful he felt, the less he wanted to take orders. The streets were whispering that he was the real power behind the throne. Nichols knew those whispers were poison. Trust could erode faster than money could move, and in their world, perception was everything. Still, Fat Cat tried to keep the peace. He spoke to Mason with the patience of an older brother, warning him that chaos drew attention, and attention was death. Mason would nod, agree, and then go right back to his old ways. Despite the friction, their partnership remained unbreakable, at least for a time. They needed each other. Mason provided muscle, Nichols provided vision. Together, they maintained control over Queens, keeping rivals at bay and money flowing. They were both too smart, and too dangerous, to let ego destroy what they'd built. But something was changing. Nichols could feel it in the air, that electric stillness before a storm. There's an old saying in the streets, you can't keep two lions in one den. Fat Cat and Pappy Mason were proof of it. The same force that made them powerful together was slowly pushing them apart. Nichols valued order, Mason thrived in chaos. And in the underworld, chaos always wins in the end. At night, as Nichols sat in quiet reflection, he couldn't ignore the unease creeping into his thoughts. The empire he'd built so carefully was becoming harder to control. His right-hand man was turning into a threat he couldn't predict. And though he didn't know it yet, the loyalty that had once protected him would soon ignite a chain of violence that would shake all of Queens. For now, though, the balance still held, just barely. Fat Cat Nichols and Pappy Mason stood side by side, kings of their world, their partnership a fragile mix of trust and tension. Together, they ruled the streets like brothers. But somewhere deep inside, they both knew, brothers can turn into enemies faster than a heartbeat when the crown becomes too heavy to share. By the mid-1980s, Queens was no longer just another borough, it was a battlefield painted in neon, money, and blood. The streets that once thrived under Fat Cat Nichols' quiet control were changing fast. The drug trade had evolved into something far more violent, far more unpredictable. Crack cocaine had swept through New York City like wildfire, transforming addicts into soldiers, corners into war zones, and profits into reasons to kill. The calm, calculated empire Nichols had built now existed in a world that had forgotten how to breathe slowly. The storm had arrived, and it was consuming everything. The South Side Syndicate was still powerful, but it was no longer alone. Dozens of small crews were popping up, each hungry, reckless, and armed. The once organized ecosystem of Queens had fractured into chaos. Crack was fast money, and fast money brought faster deaths. Nichols had always believed in control, rules, structure, hierarchy. But now, the rules were gone. Kids who barely understood the game were killing over a few dollars, and the old codes of loyalty and discipline that Fat Cat preached were fading. It wasn't business anymore, it was survival. At first, Nichols tried to adapt. He expanded his network, tightened his operations, and made examples of those who disrespected his authority. But no matter how hard he worked to maintain order, the flood of violence was uncontrollable. Shootouts broke out where handshakes used to settle disputes. The air smelled different now, gunpowder, smoke, and fear. For the first time in years, Queens felt unstable, and even Fat Cat Nichols couldn't ignore it. The tension inside his organization began to mirror the chaos outside. Pappy Mason's temper was growing harder to contain. Mason saw the crack epidemic not as a problem, but as an opportunity. To him, chaos was power. He believed that fear and domination were the only ways to survive this new era. Nichols disagreed. He wanted to keep things clean, to manage business quietly without drawing attention. Their philosophies clashed more openly now. Meetings that used to end with strategy began to end with silence, or shouting. Nichols would often sit in his office late at night, staring out through the blinds, the glow of the city painting streaks of red and blue across his desk. He could hear the distant wail of sirens and the hum of cars along Linden Boulevard. Everything he'd built felt fragile. His men were making money hand over fist, but the streets were slipping out of his control. Violence had become the language of the city, and reason was no longer part of the conversation. The government's war on drugs was intensifying. Federal agents, once slow to react, were now everywhere, listening, watching, infiltrating. Nichols' businesses came under quiet investigation. Phone lines were tapped, cars followed. The feds wanted him, but they needed proof. Nichols, always cautious, gave them nothing, at least, not directly. He had built walls of protection, using layers of middlemen and code words, but he knew how fragile those walls really were. All it would take was one slip, one betrayal, one impulsive act. And that act was coming. The turning point began when some of Nichols' younger associates, greedy, impatient, and reckless, started operating outside the rules. They robbed, fought, and killed without permission, breaking the careful order Nichols had established. To him, they weren't just bad for business, they were poison. He sent Pappy Mason to deal with it, expecting quiet correction. But Mason's version of correction was blood. What was meant to be a message turned into a massacre, and the city felt the shockwaves. Newspapers started writing about South Jamaica again, not as a neighborhood, but as a war zone. Nichols tried to pull things back under control. He called meetings, laid down rules, demanded restraint. But restraint had no place in this new world. Crack had changed everything. Addicts didn't follow codes, dealers didn't fear gods or gangsters. The fast money had corrupted the discipline that once held the streets together. Nichols' men started questioning the old ways. Why plan when chaos was profitable? Why follow orders when every block was a lottery of violence and cash? Inside, Nichols was torn. He could feel the morality that once grounded him slipping away. He'd built his empire on loyalty and logic, but the new era rewarded ruthlessness. The very thing he had used to survive, control, was becoming his weakness. The more he tried to hold on, the more the world around him unraveled. Every phone call carried tension, every meeting a quiet undercurrent of distrust. It was as if the streets themselves were turning against him, whispering that his time had passed. And through it all, Pappy Mason was rising. His name was now whispered with the same fear once reserved for Fat Cat. Mason's brand of power was raw, visible, unrestrained. He didn't care about headlines or heat. He believed in making examples, public, loud, and final. To the young generation flooding the streets, Mason looked like the future, fearless, ruthless, untouchable. Nichols knew that kind of fame was fatal, but Mason didn't care. He thrived on it. By late 1986, Queens had become unrecognizable. The empire still produced money, but it was crumbling from within. Trust was evaporating. Nichols' lieutenants began questioning decisions, skimming off profits, and whispering behind his back. Each betrayal, each act of violence, chipped away at the kingdom he had built with such precision. Even the neighborhoods that once respected him now saw only blood and fear. The same people who had once called him a protector now locked their doors when his cars passed by. At night, Nichols couldn't escape the unease that crept into his thoughts. He could feel the empire shifting under his feet. What he had built to bring order was now being swallowed by the very chaos he had tried to contain. The city was evolving, and not in his favor. The world of calculated moves and quiet power was being replaced by a generation that lived by the gun, not the code. He sat quietly in his car one evening, parked near a familiar block, watching the kids who now ruled corners that once belonged to him. They were loud, reckless, fearless. They reminded him of himself, only without discipline, without purpose. The irony cut deep. He had taught the streets to move like a business, but now that business had consumed itself. Queens, once his kingdom, was now a battlefield. And even a king can't stop a war when the soldiers no longer believe in the crown. Fat Cat Nichols could sense it, the end of peace, the rise of something darker. The crack era had not just changed the city, it had rewritten the rules. The streets no longer whispered his name in respect, they screamed it in fear. And in the world Fat Cat once controlled, fear was no longer a weapon. It was a warning. By 1987, the air in Queens had changed. It carried a new kind of weight, the invisible heaviness of being watched. The drug empire that once operated like a whisper had grown too loud, too visible. Cars that didn't belong began showing up on the same blocks every morning. Strange clicks echoed on the phone lines. Faces that once blended into the neighborhood suddenly looked out of place. The law, silent and patient, had begun to move in on Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols. He had felt it long before anyone said it out loud. The way men hesitated before speaking around him, the tension in conversations, the subtle tightening of the circle, it was the feeling every street boss knew too well, surveillance. The law was watching, waiting, and recording. But what made Fat Cat different from most was that he didn't panic. He understood that panic was the first sign of weakness, and weakness drew attention faster than money ever could. So he stayed calm, even as the walls began to close in. The DEA, NYPD, and FBI had finally joined forces. The government was cracking down on drug organizations with military precision, and Nichols' empire, well-structured, profitable, and highly visible, was an irresistible target. The federal agencies didn't just want arrests, they wanted dismantling. They wanted to prove that no man, no matter how powerful, could control a borough like a monarch. To them, Fat Cat wasn't just another dealer. He was a symbol, the face of everything the war on drugs claimed to be fighting. They started small, the way hunters circle their prey. Low-level arrests, small-time busts, quiet interrogations. The authorities knew Nichols rarely touched the product himself, so they worked upward through the chain, building cases, flipping informants, collecting evidence brick by brick. Nichols' phone lines buzzed with coded conversations, his businesses were quietly audited, and his movements tracked by unmarked cars. The empire that once seemed invisible now had a spotlight trained squarely on it. Inside the organization, the pressure was building. Nichols' men were loyal, but fear changes people. When the feds started offering deals, reduced sentences, protection, cash, cracks began to appear in the foundation. Rumors of snitches spread like wildfire. Nichols, ever the strategist, began cutting ties, moving operations deeper into the shadows, using his legitimate businesses as camouflage. But he knew what the feds knew: every empire leaves a paper trail, and his was growing longer by the day. He'd sit in his office late into the night, papers spread across the desk, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers. The blinds were half closed, the sound of the city distant but constant. In those quiet hours, he replayed every move in his mind, every deal, every meeting, every word spoken to the wrong person. The law wasn't coming for his street soldiers, it was coming for him. And no matter how careful he had been, he knew one thing for certain: no one stays untouchable forever. The investigators weren't just after evidence, they were after patterns. They followed his money, tracing bank deposits, car purchases, property records. Each lead led to another. And soon, a picture began to form: the legitimate businessman who owned dealerships and rentals was also running a drug empire from within. The pieces fit too neatly, too perfectly. For the first time, Nichols' brilliance as an organizer had become his greatest vulnerability. The very structure that made his operation efficient made it easier to map. Still, Nichols didn't flinch. He'd been through arrests before, small ones, insignificant compared to what was coming. He believed he could ride out any storm. But this time was different. This wasn't about the streets. This was about power, political, federal, institutional power. These weren't local detectives looking for a quick collar, these were career agents building a legacy on bringing him down. Fat Cat's paranoia deepened, though he rarely showed it. He stopped taking certain calls, changed vehicles daily, and limited his face-to-face meetings to a select few. He began to feel the invisible eyes everywhere, in restaurants, on street corners, even in church pews. His instincts, once razor-sharp, were now clouded by suspicion. Who could he still trust? Which of his men were talking to the feds? The line between loyalty and betrayal was blurring faster than he could manage. And then came the surveillance tapes. The DEA had bugged cars, tapped phones, and wired informants. They had hours of recorded conversations linking his name to drug movements, collections, and violent enforcement. Even coded language couldn't hide meaning forever. Every package, every shipment, every car wash job was catalogued, transcribed, and prepared for trial. Nichols didn't know it yet, but the feds were already speaking his downfall into existence in courtrooms he hadn't even seen. The newspapers began to pick up whispers of a major case in Queens. The King of South Jamaica, they called him. Some reports portrayed him as a neighborhood Robin Hood, others painted him as a ruthless criminal mastermind. Nichols never corrected either version. He'd learned that legends were useful, even dangerous ones. But the irony wasn't lost on him. While the city talked about him like a myth, the government was quietly turning him into a statistic. The mood in Queens shifted again. Cops started showing up in places they hadn't before. Raids hit smaller crews connected to his network. Nichols' men began disappearing, some arrested, others running for safety. Meetings grew tense. Every conversation felt heavier, every silence more dangerous. Even Pappy Mason, his closest ally, seemed to be drifting into his own world of violence, no longer listening, no longer loyal in the same way. Nichols' intuition told him that time was running out. He could feel it in the smallest things, the way strangers looked at him, the way his own men avoided eye contact, the faint hum of static on the phone line. He had built an empire on discipline and foresight, but the game had changed. Now, he was playing defense against an enemy that didn't sleep, didn't fear, and didn't stop. There were nights when he'd drive through the streets of South Jamaica in silence, passing the corners that had made him a legend. Kids still whispered his name, but he barely heard it anymore. The pride that once filled him had been replaced by unease. He wasn't the hunter now, he was the hunted. The law was moving slowly, deliberately, but it was moving. Files were being compiled, indictments drafted, warrants prepared. Every step he took was being logged. Every word he said was being stored. Nichols' empire, once a monument to control, was now under microscopic observation. And though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he knew the truth deep down: the eyes of the law had found their mark, and they weren't going to blink. Trust, it was the currency that had built Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols' empire. But by the late 1980s, that same currency was losing its value. The streets that once moved in perfect rhythm under his quiet authority had grown restless, divided, and unpredictable. The federal investigation circling his name had begun to infect the minds of his closest men. Loyalty, once sacred, was starting to crack under the weight of fear. And in the shadows of Queens, betrayal began to take root. It started subtly, the way all downfalls do. Whispers. Missed payments. Nervous eyes. A man who once showed up early for every meeting started arriving late. Another began drinking more than usual, talking a little too freely. Nichols, sharp as ever, noticed everything. He'd built his life on reading people, and now, he could see that the quiet loyalty he once inspired was being replaced by something else: doubt. The kind that spreads like a virus. The empire was still functioning, but its foundation was eroding. The raids, the arrests, the sudden disappearances, they were taking a toll on everyone. Men who once laughed in the face of danger were now watching every corner, every car that slowed down, every knock at the door. The pressure was suffocating, and fear has a way of bending even the most loyal soldiers. Some started talking to the feds. Others began looking for a way out, a deal, a safe house, a new start somewhere far from Queens. Nichols could sense the shift long before he had proof. In meetings, he'd sit silently as his lieutenants argued about small things: profits, shipments, turf disputes, things that never used to matter. The unity was gone. The crew was turning inward, suspicious, paranoid. It wasn't the law that scared them most, it was each other. They all knew that the first man to talk would live the longest. And that thought lingered in every conversation, like a ghost they couldn't shake. The paranoia reached even Fat Cat himself. He started moving differently, never taking the same route twice, switching cars daily, keeping his circle tighter than ever. He limited contact with most of his men, communicating through middlemen and coded notes. But the irony was cruel: the more he tried to protect himself, the more isolated he became. The empire that once thrived on trust now functioned on suspicion. Every friendship was a potential threat, every loyal face a possible mask for betrayal. One by one, the cracks widened. A courier arrested on a minor charge suddenly disappeared from the block. A dealer caught with product started whispering names in an interrogation room. Nichols didn't need confirmation, he'd seen it too many times before. Fear turns loyalty into survival. And survival doesn't care about brotherhood. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, it was who it came from. Men he had fed, clothed, and protected were now feeding information to the same system they once swore to defy. Some did it out of fear, others did it for revenge. A few simply saw an opportunity to trade one kind of power for another. Each betrayal hit Nichols not as anger, but as disappointment. He'd built his empire on the belief that structure and respect could overcome chaos. But now, he was seeing the truth: power built on fear always collapses when the fear shifts direction. The FBI knew this too. They didn't just rely on evidence, they relied on human nature. They turned his men against him one by one, using their own paranoia as a weapon. Every time Nichols cut one leak, another appeared somewhere else. The web was tightening, and he was caught in the middle, surrounded by voices he could no longer trust. Inside, Nichols' nights had grown longer. Sleep was a luxury. He'd lie awake in the dim light of his room, cigarette glowing like a tiny ember in the dark, replaying conversations in his head. Who hesitated before answering? Who avoided eye contact? Who smiled too easily? His mind was a constant chessboard now, always calculating, always anticipating the next betrayal. He had once commanded absolute loyalty through respect. Now he ruled through silence and fear. And silence, he knew, was temporary. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was structural. The same systems that had protected him, coded messages, middlemen, fronts, were now being used against him. Every weak link the feds found, they exploited. Every man they flipped, they used to climb another rung closer to Nichols. And the higher they climbed, the smaller his world became. He tried to keep his composure, even as everything unraveled. To the outside world, Fat Cat still appeared calm, the businessman, the gentleman gangster, the man who never panicked. But beneath that composure, a storm was brewing. He was angry, yes, but more than that, he was disillusioned. He'd spent years building something that was supposed to last. A structure of loyalty, discipline, and code. But codes don't survive when people get desperate. Even Pappy Mason, his longtime partner, was changing. Mason's violence was becoming unpredictable, his loyalty uncertain. He'd started acting on impulse, taking matters into his own hands without consulting Nichols. To outsiders, they still looked like allies. But inside, there was a growing tension, the kind that doesn't explode right away, but simmers until the fire finds air. By this point, Nichols knew his empire's greatest threat wasn't the law, it was decay from within. The foundation had rotted. The same streets that once carried his name in whispers were now alive with rumors. Some said he was done. Others said he was untouchable. The truth lay somewhere in between. He was still standing, but the ground beneath him was cracking. There's a loneliness that comes with power, but there's a deeper one that comes with losing it. Nichols began to feel that loneliness now, a heavy, unshakable silence that followed him everywhere. The laughter of his crew was gone, replaced by whispers. The loyalty he once inspired had turned into quiet calculation. And every time he looked around the room, he couldn't help but wonder which of the faces staring back at him would be the one to hand him over. Still, he moved with dignity. He dressed the same, spoke the same, carried himself as if nothing was wrong. Because for a man like Fat Cat, showing fear was never an option. He had built his kingdom on control, and even as it crumbled, he refused to let anyone see him flinch. But deep down, he knew the truth, his enemies weren't just outside anymore. They were sitting at his table, smiling, waiting for the moment the king finally looked away. The empire was no longer collapsing from pressure, it was rotting from betrayal. And for the first time, Lorenzo Nichols understood the bitter truth every king learns too late: the crown doesn't fall from your head, it's pulled off by the hands that once held it in place. It happened just before dawn, the kind of hour when the city holds its breath, balanced between night's last shadow and the pale promise of morning. The streets of Queens were still quiet, blanketed in mist and streetlight glow. Somewhere on a narrow block in South Jamaica, a fleet of unmarked cars rolled in silently, headlights off, engines purring low. Inside, the agents moved with quiet precision, their radios whispering codes and orders. It was the end of an era. After years of surveillance, wiretaps, and patient waiting, the law had finally come for Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols. For months, they had built the case piece by piece. The wiretaps had recorded enough. The informants had spoken. The files were thick, the timing perfect. At exactly 5:43 a.m., they moved. Doors splintered. Boots hit floors. A chorus of commands filled the narrow hallways, federal agents. Don't move. The calm, controlled empire that Nichols had ruled for years was now reduced to chaos and noise. And at the center of it all, the man himself stood quietly, as if he had been expecting it all along. He didn't resist. That wasn't his style. When the agents burst into his room, guns raised, Nichols didn't reach for anything. He just looked at them, eyes steady, expression unreadable. He'd always known this day might come. He'd planned for every possibility, every raid, every betrayal, every fall. In some part of him, it was almost a relief. The chase was over. The illusion of control, the endless paranoia, the sleepless nights, they had all led to this quiet, inevitable moment. The agents handcuffed him and read him his rights, their voices sharp against the soft hum of the early morning. Nichols said nothing. Outside, his neighbors had already gathered. Some watched in silence, wrapped in coats and disbelief. Others whispered, their voices blending with the cold wind. They had heard stories about the man who'd ruled their streets, the one who kept the peace even as he profited from its chaos. Now they saw him being led away, hands bound, head high. It wasn't a fall marked by noise or violence, it was marked by silence. Fat Cat Nichols walked calmly to the car, his steps measured, his posture unbroken. There was no shouting, no begging, no fight. Just the slow, steady dignity of a man who understood that every empire ends the same way, not with glory, but with surrender. As the car doors shut and the engines roared to life, Queens felt different. Something powerful, something mythic, had shifted. Back at headquarters, the agents moved like clockwork. Files were opened, fingerprints taken, mugshots captured. Nichols' name, long whispered in fear and respect, was now just another entry on an arrest form. But even the officers couldn't deny the gravity of it, they knew this wasn't just another arrest. They had captured a man who had become part of New York City's underground folklore. As they processed him, Nichols stayed composed. He didn't curse, didn't plead, didn't speak much at all. When asked for his occupation, he simply said, businessman. It was the same lie he'd lived for years, a truth, in a way, just not the kind written in ledgers or tax forms. The officers exchanged glances, but he didn't look up. He just waited, his expression distant, his thoughts somewhere far from the sterile room around him. News of the arrest spread quickly. Within hours, it was on the radio, the evening news, and the front page of every New York paper. Fat Cat Nichols arrested, the king of Queens Falls, the headlines screamed. To some, it was justice served. To others, it was the end of an era. In South Jamaica, mothers whispered that maybe the streets would finally be safe again. But there were others, those who had lived under his rule, those who had eaten because of his generosity, who felt something closer to grief. Because for all his crimes, Nichols had been part of their world, their rhythm. His absence would leave a void that no police raid could fill. Inside the detention center, Nichols sat alone in a cold cell, his thoughts surprisingly still. The metal bars, the concrete walls, the echo of footsteps down the corridor, none of it rattled him. For a man who had lived surrounded by danger, prison felt almost peaceful. The noise of the streets was gone. The constant tension of betrayal and survival had been replaced by something else, certainty. He knew where he was now. He knew the game had changed. And for the first time in years, there was no more pretending. He thought about his men, about Pappy Mason, whose temper had become uncontrollable, about the lieutenants who had vanished or turned, about the empire that was now being dismantled piece by piece. He thought about his family, about the people who had loved him before the money, before the name. In the quiet of that cell, he replayed his life in fragments, the laughter of old friends, the glow of the streetlights on a humid summer night, the sound of counting money by lamplight. It all seemed so far away now, like a movie he'd watched too many times to feel surprised by the ending. When he finally closed his eyes that night, he slept deeply, the first real sleep he'd had in years. The city would move on without him, it always did. The streets he had ruled would be claimed by others. His name would fade from headlines and fall into legend. But in that small moment, in that narrow cell, Fat Cat Nichols found something he hadn't felt in a long time: stillness. The empire was gone. The kingdom dismantled. The king, dethroned. But the story wasn't over yet. Because even behind bars, Nichols would remain a force, a mind that couldn't be confined by walls or locks. The world might have taken his freedom, but it hadn't taken his presence. And somewhere deep in Queens, under the flickering streetlights he once owned, people still spoke his name in the same low, reverent tone, as if the man himself might walk back into the night at any moment, gold watch glinting, eyes calm, and reclaim the throne that the dawn had taken from him. Prison walls have a strange kind of silence, not the peace of solitude, but the heavy quiet of reflection. When Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols first entered those concrete corridors, shackles around his wrists and a reputation trailing behind him, he didn't look like a man defeated. He looked like someone taking inventory, of time, of memory, of what remained. The empire he had built on the streets of Queens was now being dissected in courtroom testimonies and police reports. But even from inside a cell, Nichols was not finished. His voice, his influence, and his mind still reached beyond the walls. Incarceration changes most men, it either breaks them or sharpens them. For Nichols, it was the latter. The prison yard became his new boardroom, and the inmates his reluctant audience. He walked with the same calm authority he'd always carried, quiet, deliberate, composed. Other inmates watched him closely, whispering his name like a legend. Some had grown up hearing about Fat Cat, the man who ruled South Jamaica. Now, they saw him in person, older but still commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice or prove himself. Power, real power, doesn't fade with confinement, it adapts. Even in prison, Nichols stayed busy. His organization still existed on the outside, and he wasn't about to let it crumble completely. Through coded phone calls, letters, and visits, he continued to manage what he could. He had lieutenants still loyal to him, men who would take orders delivered through indirect channels. Money still flowed, though slower now, and loyalty still had to be rewarded. Nichols had built a system so deeply rooted in hierarchy and code that it could function, even when its creator was locked away. To the authorities, this was infuriating. To the streets, it was proof of his genius. But prison life also forced him into confrontation with himself. For the first time in decades, Nichols had time to think, to remember, to reflect. He'd pace his cell at night, tracing the same few steps, cigarette smoke curling in the dim light. Outside his window, the world moved without him. Inside, he replayed the choices that led him here. The betrayals, the losses, the false friends, the hollow victories. Power, he began to realize, was addictive, and addiction always ends the same way, with withdrawal. Still, Nichols wasn't bitter. He didn't see himself as a victim, nor did he regret the life entirely. In his mind, he'd played the game by the rules of the streets, rules that existed long before him and would exist long after. He'd taken care of his people, built something from nothing, and commanded respect in a world where survival was its own form of success. He knew the system outside his cell was just another kind of prison, one that trapped men like him in cycles of poverty, temptation, and ambition. If anything, Nichols saw himself as a product of that system, not just a casualty of it. There were moments, however, when the silence broke him, fleeting, quiet moments that came without warning. A song playing faintly on the radio. A smell from the kitchen that reminded him of home. The sound of rain tapping against the small window in his cell. Those moments cut through the armor he'd built over the years. They reminded him that beneath the legend of Fat Cat was still Lorenzo, a son, a brother, a man who once walked these same streets dreaming of more. His communication with the outside world was constant, but risky. Prison authorities monitored everything: phone calls, letters, visits. Still, Nichols knew how to speak in ways that said everything without saying anything. His coded language was an art form, words about cars and business deals that really meant operations and orders. The feds knew what he was doing, but proving it was another matter. For them, every intercepted call, every letter was another piece of the puzzle. For Nichols, it was a lifeline, his way of reminding the world that he was still in control, even from behind bars. Rumors began to circulate that he was still running his empire from prison. Some said he was giving orders for hits, others claimed he'd stepped away entirely, content to let the world spin without him. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. He no longer needed to control every detail. The machine he'd built had learned to run itself. His influence wasn't about micromanagement anymore, it was about legacy. The fear, the respect, the structure he'd created, those things didn't vanish overnight. They lingered in the streets like ghosts. Still, the world outside was changing fast. The younger generation of hustlers didn't remember the codes of the old days. The new players were reckless, violent, more interested in fame than longevity. They didn't understand the quiet power Nichols had wielded, the discipline that had kept him alive as long as he was. Watching this from prison frustrated him, not because he wanted back in, but because he saw what was being lost. The art of the game had turned into chaos. Within the prison, Nichols carried himself differently than most. He read books, about business, psychology, even history. He wrote often, filling notebooks with reflections and plans, quotes, and thoughts on power. Other inmates came to him for advice, not about crime, but about life. Some saw him as a father figure, a man who'd lived every lesson the hard way. And in his own quiet way, Nichols became a teacher. Discipline, he'd say, isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself. Those who listened found wisdom in his calm, methodical tone. Those who didn't, well, they usually ended up learning the hard way. The years began to blend. The outside world evolved, the economy shifted, the music changed, technology advanced. But inside, time stood still. Nichols grew older, wiser, and quieter. The fire was still there, but it had softened. He no longer dreamed of ruling queens, he dreamed of understanding it. He thought often about how the system had trapped him, how ambition had blinded him, and how loyalty, the thing he prized most, had become his undoing. Yet even in reflection, there was pride. He had lived on his own terms, played by his own code. He had taken from the world that never offered him anything freely, and for a time, he had won. Not many men from his streets could say the same. And though he was behind bars, he remained larger than life to those who spoke his name. There's a certain irony in prison, it's where men lose everything, and sometimes, it's where they find themselves. For Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols, the walls didn't break him, they simply stripped away the noise. Behind the steel doors and barbed wire, the man who once ruled queens began to understand that power and peace had always been opposites, and that maybe, just maybe, the only thing worth ruling was one's own mind. Even the guards knew it, the way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his walk. To them, he wasn't just another inmate. He was something else, something older, wiser, and somehow unshakable. And so the myth of Fat Cat Nichols lived on, not in the streets this time, but in the whispers of prison halls, a story of power, reflection, and the strange freedom that sometimes comes only after losing everything. When a kingdom loses its king, chaos rushes in to fill the space. From the moment Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols was taken off the streets and locked away, the fragile balance he had maintained in Queens began to crumble. His right-hand man, Howard "Pappy" Mason, now stood as the most feared, unpredictable force in the city. Without Fat Cat's steady hand to temper him, Mason's violence took on a life of its own. The streets that once followed order now pulsed with rage, fear, and blood. In prison, Nichols could only watch as his empire shifted into something darker. He'd built it on discipline, quiet structure, silent power, but Mason thrived on noise. While Fat Cat preferred calculated moves, Pappy Mason ruled through terror. With his mentor behind bars, Mason was no longer bound by restraint. He saw himself as the heir to the throne, the man destined to carry the empire forward, but his version of leadership was chaos dressed as strength. Mason had always been dangerous, but now he was untethered. He made decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and his rage was legend. His name echoed through the neighborhoods like a warning. He believed fear was not just a tool but a weapon, something to be wielded loudly, brutally, without remorse. To him, every act of violence was a message: Queens still belonged to the South Side crew, even if Fat Cat was gone. But fear, when pushed too far, becomes self-destructive. The police had already been watching Mason closely, but after Nichols' arrest, their focus intensified. Mason didn't care. He flaunted his defiance, daring anyone, cops or rivals, to challenge him. His paranoia grew alongside his ego. He began to see threats everywhere, within his own crew, among his suppliers, even among old friends. Men who had once stood beside him started vanishing, quietly erased by suspicion. What Fat Cat had built through unity, Mason was tearing apart with mistrust. Then came the moment that would change everything, not just for Mason, but for the entire city. February 26, 1988. A young NYPD officer named Edward Byrne was assigned to guard the home of a local man who had testified against drug dealers tied to Mason's crew. Byrne was only 22 years old, sitting in his patrol car in the early morning hours, the engine running, the street silent. 4 men approached. Without a word, they opened fire, killing Byrne instantly before vanishing into the night. The city erupted. Officer Byrne's murder wasn't just another killing, it was an execution of a police officer, and it shocked the nation. It was bold, senseless, and symbolic. It wasn't business, it was war. When investigators began connecting the dots, all roads led back to Pappy Mason, and, inevitably, to the empire Fat Cat Nichols had once ruled. Inside prison, Nichols heard the news like everyone else, on the television, in hushed conversations, in the ripples of tension that spread through every facility in New York. The murder of a police officer wasn't just another case. It brought heat unlike anything the streets had ever seen. Suddenly, every major law enforcement agency in America wanted blood. The war on drugs transformed overnight into a crusade. And though Nichols had been behind bars during the killing, his name was pulled into the storm. The media revived his legend. Headlines splashed across the country: Fat Cat Nichols linked to cop killing. It didn't matter that there was no direct evidence at first, the story was too big, too explosive. The man who had once been called the King of Queens was now being painted as the mastermind behind the most shocking crime in the city's recent history. Nichols knew how perception worked, he had once used it to his advantage. But now, it was being used against him. Behind bars, he seethed quietly. Fat Cat had always lived by a code: business before blood. He believed in money, power, and order. Killing cops, especially publicly, was suicide. It wasn't his style, and it wasn't his order. Yet, the lines between his legacy and Mason's madness had blurred. To the world outside, they were one and the same. His empire's violence was now his burden. Every headline, every press conference, every raid bore his name. The federal response was swift and merciless. Massive task forces were deployed. Entire networks were dismantled. Dozens of Nichols' associates were rounded up and charged under new federal laws designed to crush organized crime. The message was clear: the age of the street king was over. Queens was no longer a kingdom, it was a crime scene. Mason was eventually captured, his reign of terror ending in a flurry of police raids. But the damage was already done. The murder of Officer Byrne had not only ended Mason's career, it had sealed Fat Cat's fate as well. Nichols, already serving time, now faced additional indictments. Prosecutors claimed he had ordered hits from prison, using coded messages to communicate with his lieutenants. They painted him as the puppet master behind the violence, the man who controlled chaos from the shadows. For Nichols, it was both surreal and inevitable. He had built an empire that was supposed to outlast him, but now it was being used as evidence of his guilt. Every favor he'd ever granted, every debt he'd ever collected, was twisted into proof of conspiracy. The government wasn't just prosecuting him for crimes, they were prosecuting the myth of Fat Cat Nichols. The trial was a spectacle. Courtrooms filled with reporters. Former associates took the stand, some in tears, some cold and detached. Each testimony chipped away at his empire's illusion of loyalty. Nichols listened quietly, expression calm, eyes steady. He didn't flinch when men he'd once trusted described his operation in detail. He didn't react when prosecutors called him a businessman of death. To him, showing emotion was surrender. He sat there, stoic, watching the empire he had built being dissected piece by piece. When the verdict came, guilty on federal charges related to drug trafficking, conspiracy, and orchestrating violence from prison, the courtroom erupted. Nichols showed no reaction. He had long accepted that this was where his path led. To the world, it was justice. To him, it was confirmation of what he'd always known: power, once gained, never leaves quietly. It always demands payment. In the following years, the case became legend. Officer Byrne's death marked the end of an era, not just for Nichols, but for New York's entire underworld. Politicians used it as a rallying cry. Laws were rewritten. Sentences grew harsher. The age of the neighborhood boss, the disciplined gangster with rules and order, gave way to chaos, surveillance, and life sentences. And through it all, Fat Cat remained the central figure, the man who, even in a cell, cast a shadow over the streets of Queens. He would tell anyone who asked that the killing of Officer Byrne was madness, not business. But the world no longer made those distinctions. In their eyes, his empire had become a symbol of everything that needed to be destroyed. At night, in his cell, Nichols would sometimes replay it all: Mason's wild energy, the streets lit by fire, the newspaper headlines screaming his name. He wondered where it all went wrong. Maybe it wasn't one moment, but a slow unraveling, the moment discipline gave way to ego, control to chaos, loyalty to fear. The kingdom had devoured itself. And from behind bars, the man who once ruled it watched the flames consume everything he'd built, knowing there was no rebuilding this time. The Fat Cat era was over, not with a bang, but with a quiet understanding that even the most powerful empires can't survive the madness of their own making. The fall of an empire rarely happens in a single moment. It's not one loud explosion, not one betrayal or one act of violence. It's a slow collapse, a gradual crumbling that begins in whispers and ends in silence. For Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols, that silence had finally arrived. The murder of Officer Edward Byrne had ignited a firestorm that no one could extinguish. It was the turning point, the spark that brought the full force of the federal government crashing down on everything he'd built. In the months that followed, his name, once a symbol of control and discipline, became synonymous with destruction. Queens was no longer his kingdom, it was an open wound. The same neighborhoods that had once flourished under his order were now crawling with police. Unmarked cars idled on every block. The sound of helicopters filled the sky at night. Federal task forces kicked down doors, raided stash houses, and dragged out men who had once pledged their loyalty to Fat Cat. In courtrooms across New York, the South Side Syndicate was being dismantled one testimony at a time. Every secret, every connection, every hidden ledger, all of it was exposed under glaring fluorescent lights. From his prison cell, Nichols watched the world he'd created implode. The newspapers printed his name daily. The evening news replayed old photos of him in sharp suits and dark sunglasses, framing him as the mastermind behind Queen's drug empire, the man who brought blood to the city streets. Each story blurred the line between truth and myth a little more. The legend of Fat Cat Nichols was being rewritten by men in suits who had never set foot on his blocks, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Inside, he sat quietly, reading headlines that described him as both genius and monster. It was strange, he thought, to see his life reduced to a headline, the years of calculation, of leadership, of rules and loyalty now summarized in a few words. Kingpin. Murderer. Gang lord. The media had turned him into a symbol, and symbols don't get second chances. His trial for orchestrating hits from prison became a public spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as a ruthless ruler who continued to control the streets from behind bars. They claimed he had ordered retribution against disloyal associates, had approved violent acts through coded messages sent via visitors and phone calls. The evidence was circumstantial, but it didn't matter. Public outrage demanded a conviction. The murder of Officer Byrne had changed the landscape, politicians were pushing for results, and Nichols was the perfect headline. In the courtroom, Nichols sat still, wearing the same calm mask he'd always worn. He didn't look at the cameras, didn't react to the accusations. He let the lawyers talk, the witnesses point, the reporters scribble. It wasn't pride that kept him calm, it was acceptance. He understood the game, and this was the end game. The system he had fought his whole life had finally cornered him, not with guns or fists, but with paperwork, microphones, and men who once called him boss. Each witness was another nail in the coffin. Old friends, former lieutenants, one by one, they took the stand and told stories that mixed truth with survival. Some cried, others smirked. A few refused to look at him. Nichols didn't hate them. He knew the rules of the world they'd lived in. When the walls close in, everyone saves themselves. The irony was bitter, the same loyalty he had enforced so carefully had now become a bargaining chip for freedom. When the verdict came, it was everything he expected. Guilty. Another life sentence added to his name. For a moment, the courtroom fell into a strange kind of quiet, not celebration, not mourning, just a stillness heavy with finality. Nichols didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, stood up when the guards approached, and walked out with the same unbroken posture that had carried him through a lifetime of storms. The federal system moved quickly after that. Properties were seized, accounts frozen, vehicles confiscated. Everything tied to his name was stripped away, piece by piece. The South Side Syndicate was gone, its hierarchy shattered, its soldiers either dead or imprisoned. For all the wealth and power it had once generated, there was nothing left but ashes and stories. But what the system couldn't take were the memories, the ghosts of his empire that still lingered in the city's veins. Nichols thought often about the streets of South Jamaica, the rhythm of the blocks, the people who had once looked up to him. He wondered what they said now when his name came up. Did they curse it? Miss it? Did they tell the younger kids about the man who once ran the neighborhood with a calm hand and a code of order? There was a strange melancholy in knowing that everything he'd built, every move, every dollar, every decision, had led to this. And yet, beneath that sadness, there was also a quiet clarity. Nichols realized that his downfall hadn't begun with the police, or the media, or even the betrayals. It had begun with success. Power had a way of feeding itself until it turned into hunger, and hunger always devoured the man who carried it. In the solitude of his cell, Nichols began to write letters, reflections, fragments of thought. He wrote about loyalty, about greed, about how men confuse respect with fear. He wrote not to justify himself, but to understand himself. The streets never really belonged to anyone, he scribbled one night. We just borrow them for a while, until someone hungrier comes along. Outside, the world moved on. The headlines faded. New names replaced his. The next generation of hustlers rose without codes, without order, without restraint. They didn't remember the discipline that once defined Fat Cat's rule. To them, the past was just legend. But for the older ones, the ones who'd lived through it, his name still carried weight. Not just fear, but respect. They remembered a time when crime had structure, when a man's word still meant something. Nichols' mother visited when she could. Her presence softened him in ways nothing else could. She'd talk about family, about faith, about redemption. He'd listen quietly, nodding, smiling faintly, but his thoughts were always elsewhere, not on the world outside, but on the one he'd left behind. The one he had built with his own 2 hands and watched burn to the ground. There were nights when he could almost hear the city again, the sounds of Queens drifting through his mind like echoes, laughter, sirens, the rumble of cars over cracked pavement. He missed the rhythm of it, even the danger. But he knew he could never return to it, not as the man he once was. That life was gone, sealed in history. The fall of Fat Cat Nichols wasn't a single crash. It was a long, slow unraveling, the kind that leaves you watching your own legend die piece by piece. But even as the empire vanished, one thing remained unshaken, his understanding of power. It had built him, betrayed him, and defined him. And as he sat in the dim light of his prison cell, he finally understood the truth he'd spent a lifetime running from: power doesn't destroy men. It only reveals what they were all along. And for Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols, that revelation came too late to save his empire, but not too late to understand it. There comes a point in every man's story where the noise fades, the crowds disappear, and what's left is only memory, the echo of what once was. For Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols, that point arrived deep within the monotony of prison life. The empire was gone. The power, the cars, the entourage, all reduced to whispers and newspaper clippings. Now there was only time, and time, he found, was its own kind of punishment. In the silence of confinement, Nichols began to feel the weight of everything he had built and everything he had lost. The world outside had moved on without him. His name still carried a strange reverence in Queens, but it was the kind that comes with distance, like an old legend told around midnight by people too young to remember what it really meant. To the new generation, Fat Cat was history. To Nichols himself, he was a ghost living in the body of a man who had seen too much. The isolation brought clarity, but it also brought pain, not the physical kind, but the ache of memory. He thought often about the people who had once been his world, his mother, his children, the women who had loved him despite the life he led. He had been a provider, a protector, a ruler, but at what cost? For every person he had lifted up, there were others he had brought down. For every act of loyalty, there was a betrayal waiting in its shadow. Power had given him everything, and it had taken just as much. Sometimes, in the late hours of the night, he'd close his eyes and picture his mother. He could still hear her voice, soft but firm, warning him that the streets don't love anyone for long. Back then, he had brushed it off, thinking he could be the exception. But now, sitting alone in a narrow cell, her words felt like prophecy. He had conquered the streets, yes, but in the end, they had taken him back, piece by piece, until all that remained was the man she once tried to save. The letters from family came less often as the years passed. Some stopped writing altogether, unable to reconcile the myth of Fat Cat with the man they loved. His children grew up with only fragmented memories of him, glimpses of visits behind glass, short phone calls where silence did most of the talking. Nichols tried to offer wisdom through words, but he knew how little it meant when he wasn't there to live it beside them. Regret doesn't come in loud bursts, it seeps in quietly, like water through cracks, until everything inside you feels soaked with it. He thought often about love, not the kind found in power or loyalty, but the real kind, the kind he never had time for. There had been women who cared for him deeply, women who saw more in him than the gold chains and sharp suits. But Fat Cat didn't have space for softness back then. He believed that vulnerability was weakness, that emotion was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Now, in his later years, he realized that the hardness he once wore like armor had only kept him from the one thing that might have saved him. In the rare moments when he spoke openly to others inside, he didn't talk about money or the streets. He talked about family, about what it meant to lose connection. Younger inmates would gather around, curious to hear the wisdom of a man they'd only heard about in stories. Nichols would tell them, in his calm, steady tone, "You think the money makes it worth it. You think the power makes the pain disappear. But when it's gone, all that's left is who you were before it started. And if you don't know who that man is, you'll never find peace." He wasn't preaching, he was confessing. Every story he told was a small piece of truth, stripped of pride, stripped of myth. He spoke about loyalty, how it fades when the money stops. About love, how it withers when fear becomes the language of relationships. And about family, how even the strongest ties can fray when the world turns its back. His words didn't come with bitterness, just acceptance. The kind of acceptance that only comes after everything else has been taken. There were still moments when he tried to hold on to pieces of his past. Old photographs, folded and worn. Letters that smelled faintly of home. Small tokens of a life that had once felt invincible. He'd study them for hours, trying to bridge the gap between the man he'd been and the man he'd become. In some ways, he admired his younger self, the ambition, the discipline, the sheer willpower to rise from nothing. But he also pitied that man, because he knew now that success built on fear is just another kind of cage. Sometimes, when he'd lie awake at night, the sound of rain on the prison roof would transport him back to Queens. He'd imagine himself walking those streets again, not as Fat Cat, not as the kingpin, but as Lorenzo, the boy with sharp eyes and big dreams. He could almost see the glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, hear the laughter of kids playing stickball, smell the faint aroma of food from corner stores. Those were the only moments he felt free, in memories of a time before ambition had turned to empire. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he wanted to leave something behind that wasn't just fear. So he started speaking to younger inmates, men barely out of their teens, who looked at him with the same awe he once had for the hustlers before him. He told them what no one had told him, that the streets don't reward loyalty, they exploit it. That power doesn't make you safe, it just paints a bigger target on your back. That love, real love, is the only thing that lasts when everything else falls apart. Some listened, others didn't. But he kept talking. Maybe not for them, maybe for himself. As the years passed, the bitterness faded, replaced by reflection. Nichols had come to understand that legacy isn't about how long your name echoes, but what it means when it's spoken. His used to mean fear, now, he hoped it meant caution, a story of what happens when power blinds a man to what truly matters. He had become, in his own quiet way, a cautionary tale, not for the newspapers or the streets, but for the people who once believed they could rule them. And so, each day, as the light slipped through the small window of his cell, Fat Cat Nichols, the man who once ruled Queens, found peace not in power, but in perspective. He no longer chased the ghosts of his empire. He no longer tried to justify the choices that led him here. He simply sat, breathed, and remembered. In the end, it wasn't the money or the fame that haunted him, it was the people. The faces of those he loved and lost, the ones he disappointed, the ones he never truly got to know. He had lived like a king, but died a father, a son, a man stripped of all illusion. And in that stillness, for the first time in his life, Lorenzo Nichols finally understood what the streets could never teach him, that the truest kind of power isn't ruling others, it's learning how to forgive yourself. The years behind bars had slowed the rhythm of life for Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols, but they had not silenced his mind. In fact, confinement had a strange way of sharpening it. With the chaos gone, he could finally hear his own thoughts, the quiet, unfiltered truths he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The man who once ruled an empire built on loyalty, fear, and precision was now left with only himself, his thoughts, and the heavy weight of memory. At first, he filled his days with routine. Morning walks in the yard, brief conversations with other inmates, letters to his family. But as the months bled into years, the noise of the outside world faded completely, replaced by something else, reflection. He began to think less about what had been taken from him, and more about what he had chosen to give away. Somewhere between the hustle and the hierarchy, he had lost the one thing that made a man truly powerful, peace. So, Fat Cat did what he had rarely done in the world outside, he thought deeply about what it all meant. He began to write. Not the kind of letters filled with excuses or defenses, but meditations, thoughts on power, life, loyalty, and the strange paradox of control. He called it his philosophy, though he never intended it for the public. It was a private scripture, written in the margins of old notebooks and scrap paper. In those writings, Nichols began to dismantle the mythology of Fat Cat, the name, the reputation, the legend. He no longer saw power as something measured in fear or money. He began to understand it as something internal, something quieter. Power, he wrote one night, isn't about making others move for you. It's about standing still when the world shakes. He thought about the way he used to run his crew, the endless calculations, the constant vigilance. It had felt like control, but now, looking back, he realized it had been fear in disguise. Fear of weakness. Fear of betrayal. Fear of losing what he'd built. He had spent his life mastering everyone else's actions, but never his own. A man who can't control his anger or his pride, he wrote, isn't powerful. He's possessed. In prison, Nichols had become something of a quiet sage. Other inmates came to him not for favors or connections, but for advice. They saw in him the rare calm of someone who had already lived through every extreme, wealth, violence, fame, downfall. He didn't lecture them about morality, he simply spoke about consequences. Every choice, he'd say, is a seed. The problem is, we don't get to choose when it grows. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the narrow window of his cell, the glow of moonlight spilling across the floor. He'd think about the old days, the early hustles, the long drives through Queens, the men who had trusted him with their lives. There was no bitterness now, only understanding. We all thought we were building something permanent, he'd write. But everything we built was made of wind. Money blows away. Power fades. Only your name stays, and even that, people will rewrite. As the years passed, Nichols began to talk less and listen more. He became known among inmates for his patience, the way he could sit through another man's anger or grief without interrupting. Some of the younger ones called him, the old general. They came to him not out of fear, but out of respect. And though he never said it out loud, that respect, quiet, unforced, human, meant more to him than any title he had ever earned on the streets. His reflections grew more philosophical. He began to view life as a kind of cycle, a pattern of hunger, gain, loss, and awakening. The streets, he realized, were just one version of that cycle, a smaller reflection of how the world itself operated. Everybody's chasing something, he wrote. Some chase power, some chase peace. The trick is, most of us can't tell the difference until it's too late. He wrote about loyalty, too, the very thing that had built and destroyed his world. Loyalty, he wrote, isn't proven in peace. It's tested in distance. The ones who stay true when you have nothing, those are your people. The rest are just shadows passing through your story. He no longer spoke with anger about betrayal. In fact, he viewed it as part of life's design. People change, he would tell his cellmate one evening. Sometimes they turn on you. Sometimes they outgrow you. And sometimes, they're just trying to survive the same way you were. It's not personal. It's just the world trying to balance itself. Nichols' thoughts on morality were complicated. He didn't see himself as innocent, but he also didn't believe in simple definitions of good and evil. Every man is both, he said once during a prison group session. Good when he's loved, bad when he's cornered. I've been both. Maybe we all are. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, even the guards seemed to listen. As his reflections deepened, Nichols began to distance himself from the identity that had once defined him. The nickname, Fat Cat, no longer carried the same weight. It was a relic of a younger man, a mask that no longer fit. In his notebooks, he referred to himself by his given name, Lorenzo. Fat Cat was the dreamer, he wrote. Lorenzo is what's left when the dream wakes up. He often spoke about time, how it strips away illusions. Time, he told a young inmate once, doesn't take your freedom first. It takes your pride. It makes you see what really mattered. And it's never what you thought. That line became something of a saying among the men who knew him. They'd repeat it quietly, as if it were scripture. In his final years, Nichols found a strange peace in the rhythm of prison life. The repetition, the stillness, the lack of control, all the things that once would have driven him mad, now felt like a kind of meditation. He spent more time in the chapel, though not because he found religion in the traditional sense. What he found was humility, the quiet acceptance that every man answers to something bigger than himself, whether he calls it God, fate, or consequence. He never asked for forgiveness. That wasn't his way. But he did begin to forgive others, the men who betrayed him, the system that condemned him, even the streets that had swallowed his youth. Forgiveness, he wrote, isn't about forgetting. It's about letting go of who you were when it happened. In the end, what emerged from those years of reflection wasn't the gangster that the headlines had immortalized, but a philosopher, a man stripped of power, wealth, and legend, who finally understood what none of those things could buy, inner peace. In one of his last letters, sent to an old associate who'd written to ask him what he'd learned after all those years, he responded with a single paragraph that read like poetry: a man spends half his life trying to control the world, and the other half trying to understand why he couldn't. I don't regret what I built, only what I believed about it. Power was never the goal. It was the illusion that hid the truth, that the hardest thing to master in this world is yourself. By then, the name, Fat Cat, had become something distant, a story told in documentaries, rap lyrics, and hushed conversations. But the man behind it, sitting in a quiet cell somewhere far from Queens, had already made peace with that. The streets could keep their legend. Lorenzo Nichols had finally found what no empire, no crown, no wealth could ever give him, the calm that comes from knowing who you really are when the world stops calling your name. The longer Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols sat behind those cold concrete walls, the more his name took on a life of its own outside. Time had turned his story into something different, not history, but mythology. The newspapers had written their version, the prosecutors had told theirs, and the streets had whispered another. Each version was a reflection, distorted and colored by whoever was telling it. To some, he was a ruthless drug lord who brought ruin to a generation. To others, he was a man who rose from nothing, who ruled his world with intelligence and control. Somewhere between those two extremes lived the truth, the one Nichols knew, but few ever would. It was strange to watch your life become a story. To hear your own name turned into legend, your choices reduced to symbols. Even inside, the myths reached him. New inmates would arrive, eyes wide, eager to shake his hand, to ask him if the stories were true. They'd speak his name with awe, the way people speak about ghosts or saints. You really made $1 million a week, one would ask. Is it true you ran Queens like the mob, another whispered. Nichols never corrected them. Sometimes he'd smile faintly, sometimes he'd say nothing at all. But deep down, it unsettled him, not because they were wrong, but because they only wanted the parts of his story that glimmered. He understood it, though. The world loved legends more than truths. The myth of Fat Cat was cleaner, simpler, easier to consume. The real story, the pain, the paranoia, the loneliness, didn't fit neatly into headlines or street tales. Myths are beautiful lies told about complicated people, and he had become one. As the years passed, documentaries and articles began to appear. Reporters dug through archives, trying to capture the essence of the man who once ruled South Jamaica. Some portrayed him as a villain, a symbol of greed and moral decay. Others tried to humanize him, painting him as a product of his environment, a man shaped by the poverty and neglect of his youth. Nichols read them all, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes laughing quietly. They talked about him as though he were an idea, not a person. Fat Cat Nichols, the king of Queens, they'd say. The drug lord who brought down a generation. The street philosopher of South Jamaica. Each version was a performance, and each left something out. None of them spoke about the sleepless nights, the faces of lost friends, or the dull ache of regret that came with power. None of them spoke about Lorenzo, the boy who once dreamed of more than survival. The boy who had believed, for a time, that crime could be orderly, that he could build something stable in an unstable world. He began to reflect on how the media had always misunderstood men like him. The reporters wrote as though they were uncovering secrets, but Nichols knew they were only looking for spectacle. They wanted the blood, the cars, the stacks of money, not the meaning behind them. They wanted villains and heroes, not human beings caught in the middle. The streets don't make monsters, he wrote once in a notebook. They make survivors. The monster part comes later, when the world decides that's all you are. Still, the myths had a strange kind of power. They made him immortal, even as a prisoner. His name still commanded respect in the neighborhoods he once ruled. Young men who'd never met him would speak about him as if they had. They studied his methods, his discipline, his code. They admired the control he had maintained, even in an era of chaos. But Nichols saw the danger in that admiration. They were idolizing the mask, not the man. One day, during a visit, a journalist asked him a question that lingered long after she left: "Do you think you were a hero or a villain?" Nichols looked at her, expression unreadable, before replying quietly, "Depends on who's telling the story." He went on, "If you ask the mothers who lost their sons to the streets, I'm the villain. If you ask the ones whose rent I paid, I'm a hero. If you ask me, I was just trying to survive in a world that doesn't give second chances. The truth doesn't fit in your story. It never does." That answer became one of his most quoted lines, though he hadn't meant it for fame. It found its way into articles, documentaries, and even rap lyrics. The duality of Fat Cat, both feared and revered, fascinated people. They didn't know whether to condemn him or admire him, so they did both. And in that confusion, his legend grew. But Nichols himself had grown weary of it. He no longer cared for the spotlight, or for the endless debate over whether he was a symbol of failure or power. What interested him now was truth, the small, unglamorous truths that the world always overlooked. Like the fact that most of his so-called wealth had disappeared long before his arrest. That many of the men who called him boss were dead or gone. That power, for all its glory, had been a temporary illusion, a trick of the light that vanished when the sirens came. Sometimes he'd imagine his younger self watching him now. Would that version of Fat Cat, the confident, commanding king of Queens, recognize this older, quieter man scribbling reflections on paper? Probably not. But Nichols didn't mind. He wasn't trying to reconcile the two anymore. The legend and the man had diverged completely, and he had made peace with that. What he found most fascinating, though, was how stories evolve. People wanted to believe in clean endings, good triumphing over evil, crime punished, justice served. But life didn't work like that. Life was gray, tangled, and full of contradictions. The world wants simplicity, he wrote once. But people like me, we live in the spaces between right and wrong. We don't fit in stories. We just get turned into them. From time to time, he'd hear about films or TV specials being made about his life. He never watched them, but he'd hear the guards talk. One would say, "You know, they made another movie about you." Nichols would chuckle, "As long as they get my good side." But when he was alone, he'd think about what those portrayals meant. They weren't really about him, they were about what people wanted him to represent. Power, downfall, tragedy, or warning, whatever they needed at that moment. To the system, he was a success story, proof that no criminal escapes justice. To the streets, he was proof that one of their own could rise higher than anyone imagined. To himself, he was just a man learning to live with the echoes of his own choices. He once told a cellmate, "The problem with legends is that they outlive the lessons." It was true. The myth of Fat Cat had become louder than the wisdom of Lorenzo. The young men who admired him didn't see the sleepless nights, the endless paranoia, the loneliness of command. They only saw the power, not the price. Still, he didn't try to erase the myth. In a strange way, he respected it. "People need stories," he said once during a rare interview. "They need someone to point at, to blame or to believe in. I just happened to be that story for a while." He paused before adding something that didn't make it into the final article, "But if they really want to understand, tell them this: I didn't fall because I was evil. I fell because I forgot I was human." That, he believed, was the truth that lived beneath every headline and every legend, the one no one ever wanted to hear. Myths make gods and devils, but real life only makes men. And men, no matter how powerful they become, always bleed the same. By the time the world moved on to newer names and newer scandals, Nichols was at peace with his story, both the truth and the lie. He understood that the legend of Fat Cat would live long after he was gone, retold in barbershops, documentaries, and whispered tales on corners he once ruled. But he also knew that the real legacy, the quiet one, lived not in the myth, but in the understanding he'd gained. The myth had been the noise. The man, at last, had found the silence beneath it. Time inside moved differently for Lorenzo, Fat Cat Nichols. Days folded into months, years into silence. The noise of the outside world faded, replaced by a rhythm of walking, reading, and quiet reflection. The empire that once consumed his every breath had long vanished, but the man remained, older, wiser, softer. He no longer sought power. What he craved now was understanding. Younger inmates often approached him with curiosity, drawn by the legend of Fat Cat. He listened more than he spoke, offering advice in fragments. "You don't learn when you talk," he'd say. "You learn when you start listening, to your mistakes, to time." He watched generations of men come and go, all chasing the same illusions he once did. Money. Status. Fear disguised as respect. "The game never ends," he'd murmur. "Only the players change." Outside, his name lived on in documentaries and lyrics, but he paid it no mind. The myth had its own life now. What mattered to him was peace, the kind that came not from freedom, but from acceptance. The walls didn't confine him anymore, the past did. But in letting it go, he found something rare: clarity. Power had been fleeting, but wisdom lasted. "You can't own respect," he told one inmate. "You rent it. And the rent's due every day." By then, the once feared King of Queens had turned into a quiet observer of life, a man no longer chasing control, but learning the beauty of surrender. In his stillness, Fat Cat Nichols finally understood what freedom really meant, not walking the streets, but being at peace with himself. Decades after his fall, South Jamaica, Queens had changed. New families filled the blocks where Nichols once ruled. The corners were quieter, the storefronts cleaner, yet his name lingered like a ghost in the air. To the old-timers, Fat Cat was more than memory, he was legend, both feared and respected. Some spoke of him as a tyrant, others remembered him as a man who brought order to chaos. He kept the peace in his own way, one elder would say, staring down Linden Boulevard. For many, his story had become a lesson, that ambition burns brightest before it destroys. The younger generation knew his name from songs, not stories. To them, Fat Cat was mythology, a symbol of power and rise, detached from its cost. They saw the gold and cars, not the sleepless nights or the broken trust that came with them. The streets remember differently, though, with a mix of awe and regret. Occasionally, reporters returned to revisit his legacy. They called him the King of Queens, the man who controlled a borough. But the truth was quieter. Nichols had never just ruled, he had balanced a city that lived between hunger and survival. And when he fell, that fragile order fell with him. To those who knew him, the myth never captured the man. They remembered the calm in his voice, the discipline in his movement, the sadness in his eyes. He was not a villain, nor a saint, just a man who flew too close to power and watched it turn to dust. Queens had moved on, but it hadn't forgotten. The streets never do. In his final years, the noise of the world drifted away, leaving only silence and thought. Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols, once the king of Queens, had become a man at peace with himself. The hunger for control that once defined him was gone. What remained was reflection. He had stopped measuring life in power or money. Instead, he measured it in lessons. Every decision, every loss, every betrayal had shaped him into something more than legend, human. He no longer sought redemption, only understanding. "I built my own prison," he once wrote. Not from walls, but from pride. The world outside still spoke his name, sometimes in praise, sometimes in warning, but Nichols no longer cared how the story was told. Myths fade, truth remains. "I wasn't good or bad," he said once. "I was just what the world made me." As he grew older, he found peace in simplicity, a walk in the yard, a page of reflection, a rare laugh with another old-timer. He forgave himself quietly, without ceremony. Forgiveness, he realized, was not forgetting, it was understanding who you were when it all happened. In the end, the man who once ruled Queens didn't die a legend. He died a human being, thoughtful, calm, and finally free. Not free from bars, but from the weight of his own story. Every empire fades. Every crown turns to dust. But somewhere in the stillness of memory, the name, Fat Cat Nichols, endures, not as a warning or a worship, but as a whisper of truth. Even kings must learn how to rest.